Thank you, Mr. Corellis. And welcome, everybody. We got kind of a fuller house than typical. That's nice to see. Welcome, everybody online that is shown up there. Anybody that might be on the phone. And welcome to another Sabbath. We haven't really been together with a lot of these numbers of people since the feast. It's nice to see everybody again, now that everybody seems to be back in the swing of things. And so what I'd like to do is kind of talk a little bit about trials. I think that that's pretty safe a topic that everyone can relate to. If not, then congratulations. But most of us are acquainted with these, I'm sure. Trials never seem to be enjoyable, do they? Maybe that's why they're called trials. They take many forms. There are many forms of trials out there. Physical ailments is a big one. Physical pain, the body's not working right. Financial, that's another big one for a lot of people. Property breaking down, things going wrong with the house, car breaking down, kind of ties in with the financial thing as well. Deaths of loved ones, just other people in general, dealing with fights and arguments and slanderings and thefts and, human nature. And then there's things out there that we would never have ever thought of that pop up. And many can be quite overwhelming. What does the Bible say about them, though? I'm going to turn to James. I think I passed it. James 1, starting in verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, which is also endurance or perseverance. But let patience have its perfect work, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Now, we've heard that many times, rejoicing at your trials. Count it all joy. But if you look closely at what that is actually saying, we are to rejoice because it helps us along our quest to become perfect and complete. Trials can be for a number of reasons too. They could just be a correction or a chastisement to get us back on course. They could be a test or an examination to find out what we'll do in a certain situation. There could just be a simple lesson to be learned in all of it. And then, of course, you have just our own stuff that really they can just be a consequences of bad decisions we've made. Some trials are definitely self-inflicted. God may not always be the direct instigator of a trial, but he does have control over everything, and he will allow it to happen. Regardless, they're all opportunities for growth, whether we see them or not. Who would you say is probably the most famous trial bearer of all time? I think Job would be most everybody's nominee, unless you were thinking yourself. I didn't even hear what was shouted out. Job. Turn to Job 1. Job 1, starting in verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Satan answered the Lord, said, "From going to and fro on the earth and walking back and forth on it." Now listen to this. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" Now, I'm not going to go through all the things that happened with Job. I think most of us are familiar with it, or have heard it many times in the past. But the point here is, God is the one that brought Job up to Satan's attention. He's the one that brought him up. Said, "Hey, have you thought about my boy Job?" And he instigated the whole thing. And he used Satan to put Job through those trials. Later in those trials, Job, in chapter 10 of Job, Job 10, verses 8 and 9, your hands have made me and fashioned me in intricate unity, yet you would destroy me. Remember, I pray, that you have made me like clay, and will you turn me into dust again? Job's likening himself to clay that is formed and fashioned by God. And later on, in verse 33, I won't turn there, but in verse 6, when his friend Elihu is talking to him, he repeats, I also have been formed out of clay. See, this idea, God being compared to a potter, and we as clay in his hands, is a very common and repeated theme in the Bible. It's here in Job, and Job is one of the earliest books written. It goes all the way through into the New Testament as well. God is the master potter, and we are clay in his hands. And what does a potter do with clay? I want you to keep in mind some of the physical things that are going on with the clay here, and metaphoric connections to maybe some trials around that you've had. When the clay is collected, it has undesirable things in it, sticks and rocks and leaves and some other nasty stuff. They are all forcefully removed from it, and other things are added to it, such as water and sand, to make the clay the consistency desired. Further prepared by kneading, the clay is smashed, it's mashed, it's thrown around, oftentimes thrown on the ground and stamped and stomped on with their feet to soften it up so it becomes malleable. It is trampled underfoot. And a quick scripture on that, Isaiah 41:25 says, I have raised one up from my north, and he shall come. From the rising of the sun shall he call upon my name. He shall come upon princes in mortar, as the potter treadeth the clay. It talks about how the potter treads the clay with his feet. But if the vessel is not taking the shape the potter wants, or it's drying out, the potter dumps it back into the lump and he reworks it. Jeremiah 18, first 6 verses. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause you to hear my words. Then I went down to the potter's house, and there he was, making something at the wheel. And the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter, so he made it again into another vessel, as it seemed good, the potter to make. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter, says the Lord? Look, as the clay in the potter's hands, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. God likens himself to a potter there, and he says, can I not do with you, the whole nation, what this potter is doing with this clay right here and there? It gets put on the wheel, it gets spun around and around, pushed on and shaped into odd places, and some things come to mind. God's thoughts are not our thoughts. What he has in mind is usually not what we have imagined. Okay? In Isaiah 45. Isaiah 45:9. Woe to him who strives with his maker. Let the potsherd strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him who forms it, What are you making? Or shall your handiwork say, He has no hands? We don't know everything that's going on. It takes wisdom to know that you don't know. But God does, and he's working with you. God's in charge of forming you. Now, this quick little side thing, a little bit of a speculation here, because it's not exactly formed, spelled out. But God is the master potter. He considers himself that. It's a theme through the Bible. And even at the very beginning, in Genesis 2:7, it says God formed man. That word formed there, if you look up what it means, definitions are molded as a potter. Another one is squeezed into shape. Now, for many years, I used to think that God was just stood way back, like way, way back. And he just mentioned it by word, and he spoke it, and it happened. but he's the potter, and it says he formed him out of the ground. Is it beyond a possibility he was physically or spiritually actually forming man with his hands? He was right there, and he formed it into shape. He made the head and the arms, and he stood there lifeless with him. And then it says he breathed into him. He didn't just blow on him. He breathed life into him. And you could probably imagine seeing the man's consciousness up here. And I imagine God stood there with a smile when that happened. Why not? Have you ever seen a potter working? His sleeves are usually rolled up. His pants are usually rolled up. He's into an elbow deep, usually, if it's not covered head to toe. He's in it. He's engulfed in his work. God is not a hands-off God. He never has been. But there's always need to be refining after all of that. Because the next stop for the clay is the kiln. The kiln fires the pottery at about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. After this, the impurities are fired out of it and is no longer pervious to dissolving in water. It has undergone a permanent chemical change. It's then glazed, and after a coating of paint or glaze is put on it, it's fired again at about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. There have been cases where there have been house fires and homes that have caught on fire, and everything in there is completely destroyed. Everything is ash. And they've gone in and they have found everything destroyed except for vases and pottery, which come out in perfect condition. Probably even cleaner than they were before, because the fire burnt the dust that was allowed to collect on them. Why? Because the pottery, the clay, has already been purified by fire. What is a house fire going to do to it that 2 blasts in the kiln that probably burnt twice as hot is going to do to it? It's already been tested by fire. At this point, the material is considered nearly indestructible. And it got that point by having things taken from it, beaten up, beaten down, stomped on, smashed, spun around, and put through fire. Now, you could say, well, these are pretty much indestructible, but you can, knock it off the table and crack it or break it, The material's indestructible. The vase, maybe an accident can happen and it can break. But there's a long-time Japanese art, and I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think it's pronounced kintsugi or kintsugi. They fill and rejoin the cracks of broken pottery, and they do it using usually gold or silver or platinum, but it's oftentimes gold, which is another material that is purified by fire. They reinforce the piece, and it's now the vase or vessel or whatever they have put and molded the cracks with and put it back together is now considered stronger, more unique. It's heralded for its experience, and it's sometimes considered priceless. See, even in our mistakes and follies, God will create something even stronger and even more beautiful and infinitely more valuable than the original, simply by picking the pieces up from what we broke. In closing, I know it's very hard to keep things in mind when you're in the trial, and sometimes God lets you be in it and sweat it out for a while. And when that's going on, it is difficult to keep your mindset on rejoicing at what's going on. But do try to think, though, that God is in charge, and what you're going through is only for your good. Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.